Hello. In lab report number 10, I've made an inspection of the items that you see here lying on the ground, and these parts comprise a lathe. And I recommend you to watch that video, which you can find in the video description, to see some more detailed footage of the actual state that these parts are in. And the first thing that I want to take care of is to remove the old paint from some of the basic parts that comprise the basic structure of the lathe, including the legs, one of which is sitting here on this mobile workbench, and of course the machine bed that we see here. So this video of course is part of my lathe restoration series, but it can also be useful for anyone who wants to remove paint and rust from any other old device. And that is why the majority of this video is really about different means of mechanical paint removal. And the first method that we're going to use here is wire wheeling. And of course many of you know the old-fashioned wire brush, but if you want to use a manual tool like this for a job like this, well, you can work on that till kingdom come, really. And that is why I'm doing most of the grunt work on this project with a large wire wheel sitting on a 14mm threaded rod here on this large angle grinder of mine. And you can see that this wire wheel here, or in Germany we call it Topfdrahtbürste, which means pot wire brush, because it's shaped like a pot, you know. And you can see that the wires on here are already quite short. That's because I've been using this for the better part of a year or so. But this method is really quite cheap, because you can buy a new wire wheel like this one. See, this is even a Bosch product, so no cheapo. And I guess I paid less than 10 euros for this. And you can really work lots of hours with a brush like this on different projects. A large wire wheel is a good way of removing a lot of paint in a short period of time. But it is only suited for flat surfaces that can easily be accessed. You should wear safety goggles here, because it happens once in a while that one of the wires gets loose and flies through the air like a projectile. When doing this kind of job, especially with old paint that might contain lead, it is a good idea to wear a dust mask. And here you can see the different layers of paint. This is the actual color of the cast iron itself. Then we have a first layer of paint that is a dark gray. Then we have two layers of green color. And then on top of that, this grayish paint here. But there are also many different kinds of wire wheels that can be used in conjunction with power drills. And I guess these are particularly interesting if you have to reach inside indentations and other places that cannot be accessed by a large pot-shaped brush like this one. But even using these tiny wire wheels, we're not capable of reaching all the places around the leg, because there is still an old switch, an outlet, and some steel parts that are used to attach the electric motor to the lathe in place, and we have to disassemble that before we can go on. But in order to complete this paint removal job, I employed methods very different from wire wheeling as well. And one of them is to use a tool like this. Now in Germany this is called Druckluftnadelentroster, which means pressured air needle deruster. And it says here that the English name is spring balancer, but that is obviously a translation error, since a spring balancer, as far as I know, is a very different thing. I guess you would call this a needle gun or a needle deruster or something like that. Maybe just post something in the comment section if you know what the man in the shop usually calls this tool in the English language. But no matter what you call it, how it works is that you connect this to a pressured air system, to a compressor, And then you have these set of steel needles here, which jump or dance, so to speak, on the surface of the metal that you're working on. And I have seen this the first time in automotive work, where it's often used for paint and rust removal. Now, even though I just bought this only 3 days ago to be used in this particular project, you can see that it already has considerable signs of wear. And that might have to do with the fact that this tool was actually very cheap. I only paid about 30 euros, while you normally can pay 200, 250 euros or more for a tool of this type. And my first experiences with this have been very good, but you should wait a little longer until deciding to buy this particular tool, because, you know, working for 1 or 2 days is one thing, but finding out if it's really worth buying is something else.
But independent of the question if this particular tool is a good needle gun or not, I really have to say that this needle derusting thing is now one of my new hobbies. Really works like a charm.
So the next method for paint removal and rust removal that I used in this project is sandblasting, or Sandstrahlen as we say in German. And both of those terms are actually misleading, at least these days, since it is not normal any longer to use sand for this job. You use other materials for that. And the sandblasting really has the advantage over the two other methods that it is much less invasive. So I guess that depending on the kind of material that you use for blasting, the surface of the metal that you remove the paint or rust from is much less damaged than, for example, with a wire wheel or with a spring balancer. So I basically use this for the finer parts of the job, or to reach certain spots on the cast iron that I couldn't reach with the other methods.
So sandblasting really is a good way to get rid of all the dirt and grime, rust and paint that might be in the smallest of pores or indentations on the surface, and you can really clean up your workpiece well. But it also has a lot of disadvantages, one being that you have to wear a mask that covers your entire face, and you also have to protect your hands from that stream of blasting material, because believe me, it hurts when you come in contact with that. You're also creating something of a mess if you do not use a sandblasting cabinet. Well, you could build one of those yourself, but I didn't have the time to build a cabinet for the size of these workpieces without unnecessarily delaying the lathe restoration project. So all this wire wheeling and needle derusting and sandblasting went on and on and on for hours. I know it doesn't look like much, but believe me, it was grueling work. And so that I at least have a little feeling of accomplishment, let's take a look at a before and after comparison here. And with the legs been taken care of, it's now time to start working on the machine bed. And as you can see, it is just as dirty, rusty, and covered in several layers of paint as the legs were before it. And what we will do now is to remove the paint all around the bed without even touching the ways of the machine bed. And we also find a little nameplate here, of which I hope that it would tell us the original manufacturer of this lathe, but it only tells us a number. There would have been another nameplate on the other end of the bed, but that one is missing. And after a couple of hours of work, the paint around the bed is all but gone. And what remains to be done now is to clean off the ways. We will neither de-rust them nor do anything of the likes of scraping or grinding them in this video. That will probably be done in a much later episode though. There are lots of other things that I will have to do first, as I will explain later in this video. There's really just super much grime and dirt on the ways, and to get that off I will use some brake cleaner. Now I know this is not the traditional way to do this, but I just happen to have a lot of brake cleaner and I think that it's good enough to get off like the raw stuff. One advantage of that is that I can also clean some dirt out of the insides of the bed, which is otherwise quite inaccessible. And after having done that, I use an old rag and some gasoline to further clean the ways. And here the quite necessary before and after comparison.
So we are inside the house now, and you can see that I have made some room to the left of these two workbenches here. I used to store stuff in here, but actually I decided a long time ago that I don't want to use the workshop space for storage anymore. I have other rooms for that. And we have about 2.5 meters clearance to the left side of these two workbenches here, which I use for smaller metalworking projects. The bigger and dirtier stuff is typically done in the basement or in the garage. But I guess that this would be a good place for the old lathe. This is a very dry room, so we don't have to think about rust so much. What we have here are of course our two cast iron legs and the cast iron bed, but we also have this large steel rod here, which is threaded at both ends, and I removed the old paint and rust from this one as well. And we also have these set of nuts here, which of course belong to these threaded ends, and the rod is supposed to give or to add additional stability to this basic frame structure of the lathe. And what we will do now is simply to assemble that basic frame structure, and I will then later think about maybe repainting these parts or maybe just applying a little bit of oil, the likes of ballastol, to the surfaces. But even if I want to repaint this, I will do this in the very end after everything else has been taken care of, because it might be necessary to make some modifications to this frame. For example, drill a few holes here and there to add additional structures, and it would be stupid to apply new paint before doing that. And then there are two additional holes where a second set of bolts can be inserted, and they allow for quite a lot of tolerance, since the diameter of this upper hole here is much larger than that inside here, and this one is not threaded, so a nut has to be screwed on that bolt. But the bolts that actually came with this lot are insufficient in my opinion, so I will first have to buy some other bolts for this. And then there is also this large piece of construction steel that came with the lathe, of which I said in the first video that this is actually obviously not part of the original equipment that came with the lathe, but maybe we will use this anyway to stabilize this frame. And there is still a little bit of paint on the machine bed itself, or on the ways actually, and that shows you that the green paint that we found on here was definitely applied by some guy, and he did a kind of a sloppy job putting paint on the sides and even to a part on top of the ways. And I didn't remove this by mechanical means because I really don't want to put any new scratches into the ways. And here I'm using just a piece of cloth with universal thinner to rub off that old paint. It's a bit tedious, but I see that it comes off. Okay, so the most basic parts of the structure are assembled. The paint has been removed, and also most of the grease and dirt on the machine bed has been removed. So what is the next step and how will we proceed after that? The next thing to do is to remove the rust on the ways. And I don't want to use mechanical means for that. That is why I didn't use the sandblasting technique or anything else up to this point to remove the rust. And what I want to do is to use chemical means of removing the rust. So if you have some experience with chemical rust removers and you can name particular brands or products that are helpful, then please post something about that, maybe with a link in the comment section. That would be of great help to me. So how will we go on after that? Well, we still have all of the other parts in their original shape. And the next thing that I will do is probably to start with the tailstock. That means taking it apart as far as possible, removing the paint, then removing the rust, again by chemical means if possible. And then I will proceed in the same way with the headstock and the support. That will be a whole lot more complicated because there are much more parts involved. And after that, I will take a look at the pulleys and at the whole system that connects the motor to the headstock. And that will again involve a whole lot of paint removing, rust removing, greasing, and so on. After that is done, we can go over to the electrical part of this whole undertaking, and that will mean to decide on whether to reuse this motor or to use another motor, and then see in which configuration it will be used. We will then talk about using variable frequency drives and other methods. And when all that is done, we can talk about aligning all the parts, also about scraping the ways of the machine bed and everything that involves precision or the possibility of precision machining, which is still a big question mark if it will ever be possible for us to use this for anything close to precision work. So that's the plan. Hope you like this and see you soon.